The notion that God works through unlikely people is probably not unfamiliar to anyone in the room. Well, maybe Shay. Shay probably has not heard that before. But the fact is, it's been well observed, well documented. It's been the subject of a lot of preaching and teaching over the millennia that the church has existed, that God works through unlikely people. There is, however, a question of perspective on this. And so we're going to take 2 Sundays and explore this business of God working through unlikely people from 2 general different perspectives, because perspective matters on these things. And one perspective is the perspective of the person who's being called. In this case, Moses' perspective, the sense that Moses himself perceived himself to be unqualified for the work that God was calling him to do. We're going to look at Moses' perspective next week. This week, we're going to look at the other perspective here, which is the perspective of those to whom Moses was sent. Pharaoh and the royal court, God sent Moses to Pharaoh saying, tell Pharaoh, let my people, or that I say, let my people go so that they may worship me. And Moses was sent to God's people, the Israelites, the Hebrews living in slavery in Egypt, to lead them out of bondage, out of slavery, so they could break free and then live free in the promised land. From their perspective, from the perspective of Pharaoh and of the Israelites, Moses was also eminently unqualified for the job to which God had called him, and terribly unlikely to be the person who God would send to, from Pharaoh's perspective, to confront him, and from the Israelites' perspective, to save them, to lead them to freedom. That Moses was an unlikely person. Now, again, God does this often, but we also see this dynamic in literature as well, where the salvation comes from an unlikely source. The messenger, the one that's sent with the message of salvation, is someone that the person who's supposed to receive the message doesn't particularly want to listen to, and you wouldn't necessarily expect them to listen to it. Now, I'm going to ask your forgiveness because I know it's August. I know it's still hot outside, but I want to talk about Christmas. Is that okay? Can we talk about Christmas for just a minute? All right, I'm going to take that as a yes. One of my favorite Christmas stories is A Christmas Carol. And whether you've read the book or seen one of the many different movies, the best of which, in my humble opinion, is A Muppet Christmas Carol. If you've read it, you know the story. You know that Scrooge is a stingy, greedy, nasty, cantankerous, selfish, egotistical old curmudgeon. And he's got a rotten attitude about life. He's got a rotten attitude about people. He's got a rotten attitude about money. He's got a rotten attitude about everything. And he has, we are told, bound himself in chains of his own greed. Chains which he can't see. He's a slave, like many people are, to greed. And he can't even see the chains. He doesn't even know that they exist until he sees a ghost. Jacob Marley, his old partner, sent back from the dead to warn him and to tell him that he would receive 3 messengers who would help him break free from those chains and live free from this point forward. And Scrooge didn't want it. He didn't want it. He didn't want Jacob to be a messenger. He thought him unlikely. Who are you to tell me you were as bad as I was? He didn't want these 3 ghosts. He said, why does it have to be 3? Can't we just send one and get it all over with at one time? And Jacob's like, this is how it's going to be. And Scrooge was left with a choice. Do I receive these messengers or not? Do I take their message seriously or not? Do I follow their lead or not? This is the exact situation that the Israelites and Pharaoh were in. Someone was being sent to them that they didn't have any respect for, that they didn't have any reason to respect, that they didn't have any reason to acknowledge to be a prophet or a leader or anyone that they should listen to or anyone that God would work through. Moses was an eminently unlikely person to be sent to them to confront them or to lead them to freedom. Moses was, in a word, well, 2 words, an unlikely deliverer. for a number of reasons. I'm going to walk through those reasons because the reasons matter and God addresses the reasons. We're going to break the list of reasons into two groups, Moses' first 40 years and Moses' second 40 years. Here, I got bad news for you. If you are approaching retirement or thinking of retiring anytime soon, Moses was 80 years old when God met him in the burning bush. And then he had another 40 years of work to do after that. So you never know. God might have more work for you to do, even well past 80. Moses' first 40 years, there are several things that disqualify him for both the Israelites and for Pharaoh. First of all, he should be dead. He shouldn't even be alive. By the decree of Pharaoh, he should have been killed at birth. He should not even have been allowed to live. And yet here he was. Second, he grew up away from his people, among and in the luxury of their oppressors. Moses didn't know what it was like to grow up as a slave. He spent the first few years of his life being nursed by his mother in his mother's home. So he knew from that perspective, at least as a very young child, that his people were in slavery, but everyone else his age, every other boy his age, was dead. Why was he spared? He shouldn't have even been there. So he starts off with life just as a privilege compared to his peers around him. Plus, he was going to be immensely freer than any of them would be. As soon as he was weaned, he's taken to the palace, he's given to Pharaoh's daughter, and she raises it from there, and now he lives in the lap of luxury. He's not living in a hovel. He's not being forced to do manual labor for hours and hours and hours a day for very, very little or no pay. He's not being treated brutally. He's got people washing his clothes. He's got people preparing a bath for him. He's got wonderful bed to sleep in. He's getting education. He's getting pampered. He's getting preened. He's getting cared for. He's getting coddled compared to what his people are experiencing. Why? How could he possibly lead 1 million plus people who have been living in slavery for generations when he doesn't even know what it is like to be a slave? Sure, he can see it from a distance, but it's very different from experiencing it. Third, he was rash, hot-tempered, and violent. The last person you want leading a diplomatic mission like this, because the mission wasn't go and start a war. The mission wasn't go and lead a rebellion. The mission was go and tell Pharaoh to let my people go so that they may worship me. You want someone calm, cool, and collected. Moses was none of those things, at least in his first 40 years. When he knew he was a Hebrew, he knew his people were enslaved, and we know he was not happy about that because when he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, he murdered the Egyptian. He had no legal authority to do that. He had no right to do that. He felt justified in doing that. And maybe he was thinking, this is a good example. If my people will just rise up, we can fight back, we can be free. But that's not how it worked. He was in a position of privilege. He could do things that none of his other people could do. He could commit that crime and cover it up and at least for a time experience no consequences. If a Hebrew slave rose up and killed their master, what would have happened? Horrible things would have happened. He was rash, hot-tempered, and violent. He needed a cool, diplomatic, reasonable, wise, discerning person. He was an ineffective leader that was rejected by his own people. He found two of his own people fighting with each other, and he said, "Come on, guys, stop fighting. How can we ever be free from the Egyptians if we're just going to keep fighting amongst ourselves like this? How can we resist them if we're not united? Let's get together. Let's stop fighting with each other." And they looked at him and said, "Who are you to tell us what to do? You know nothing." Jon Snow just came to my mind there. You know nothing about our situation. And what are you going to do? You going to kill us the way you killed the Egyptian? They totally rejected Moses' leadership. Who was he to try to lead them? Who was he to try to tell them what they ought to do and how they ought to do it? He was nobody who knew nothing. and he was rejected. And then he became a fugitive because now he knows that his murder wasn't covered up completely. He covered up the body, but somehow people knew and the word was out there. And now Moses reveals himself to be not only rash, hot-tempered, and violent, but also a bit of a coward because he flees for his life. And he becomes a fugitive from the law. He doesn't stay and face the consequences. He doesn't stand up for Pharaoh and demand justice for his people. He just runs. And when Moses runs, he runs. He ran a long, long way. And we're going to see about that in the second 40 years of Moses' life, because he was 40 when he ran away. He was not a young guy. He was not some brash, immature kid. He was a grown-up man who was hot-tempered and violent. And a bit of a coward. The next 40 years of his life, he probably was weaned somewhere around the age of 5, and so spent 35 years living in the palace, and then he spends the next 40 years living in Midian. Now, maybe you're not an expert in biblical geography, like I am not an expert in biblical geography. I find maps useful. I thought I was going to be able to use the laser pointer, but I discovered this morning you can't see the laser pointer when it's on the TV screen. It just disappears. But I've got some better maps that are a little easier to see as well. So Moses started, let's just go to this one. Moses started up in that area that was lower Egypt, somewhere in there. That was where the region of Goshen was. That's where kind of the capital city of the Egyptian empire was. And he fled all the way to Midian down there in the bottom right. He had to cross the Sinai Peninsula to get there. The Sinai Peninsula was not part of the kingdom of Egypt. It was a separate country. It was under the control of Egypt. They dominated it, but it was not Egypt itself. So Moses put an entire nation between himself and the Egyptians, between himself and Egypt, between himself and his people. And depending on where, we don't know whether he stayed in northern Midian, mid-Midian, or southern Midian. But if he went straight across the Sinai Peninsula and stayed in northern Midian, that's a journey of 200 miles. He went at least 200 miles away, maybe as much as 250 miles away. And again, there's no phones, no lights, no motor cars, not a single luxury. He's not driving back for Christmas. He's not driving, he's not FaceTiming, he's not calling. This is 40 years of total and complete separation from his people. He's out of their sight, out of their mind. 2 generations of people grow up and reach adulthood after Moses leaves. And that's who's left in Egypt. Moses runs. He runs a long, long way away. He was geographically disconnected and distant from both the privileges of the palace and the problems of the Hebrews. He was eventually out of sight, out of mind in the palace. He no longer, if he ever had any sort of position of influence in there, it was long gone. And he was now utterly and completely and totally disconnected from his people. He, in fact, joined and started a new family. He gets to Midian, he sits down at a well, he meets one of the first people he meets, he ends up marrying her, joining her family, and starting a family of his own. They have children together. And again, he spends 40 years there. And he's not a slave, he's free. He's not living a pampered life anymore. He's not living in luxury anymore. He's got a rough life. He's a shepherd. He sleeps out in the wilderness with his sheep, tending the flocks, protecting them from wild animals, guiding them to food and water, taking care of them as a good shepherd would. And he does that for 40 years. It's a rough life, it's a rugged life, but it's a free life, and it's an honest life. And there's no reason to believe that Moses did not enjoy the life that he had with his wife and his kids and this new family in Egypt. And by the time God met him on the burning bush 40 years later, he had far more experience as a shepherd than he did as a prophet or a leader. Far more experience. Now we know that shepherds, God leads his people. He sends people to guide them like a good shepherd. But the skills of a shepherd, you don't train to lead 1 million+ people out of one empire through a wilderness and to take another bit of land for themselves. You don't build your skills for that by spending 40 years with sheep. There is some overlap because sheep, like people, are dumb and can't care for themselves most of the time. And we people behave dumbly and don't take care of ourselves well most of the time. So there is some overlap, but the skill set is not the same. No one ever trained their leaders by sending them to be shepherds. Moses spent 40 years as a shepherd, 40 years out of sight, out of mind from the people back in Egypt, both in the palace and in slavery. And to add to all of this, he had a genuine struggle with speech. He had some sort of speech impediment. We don't know what it was. Some translations say that Moses stuttered, but that's an interpretation more than a translation. The literal translation is that Moses was slow of mouth and slow of tongue. And we don't know whether it was a stutter or some other kind of speech impediment, but he struggled to speak. With all of those other things that disqualified him, he couldn't even come up and give a dramatic, stirring halftime speech to rally his people to trust God and follow. It just wasn't in him. He didn't have the skills. He didn't have the wiring to do that. And that was Moses. Perhaps the least likely and least qualified person in the world to lead the Israelites out of slavery through the wilderness and into the promised land. That was Moses. But God. But God. That's who God called. That's who God sent. That was the deliverer that the Israelites got. It was the messenger that Pharaoh got, was this unqualified, unlikely shepherd who had murdered and run away and didn't have the respect of anybody at this point in his life, apart from his own family all the way over in Midian. What did God do? Moses said to God, when God first called him, Moses said, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? I am not qualified for this, God. I am a nobody. I am less than a nobody. You need to find someone else." We'll get to Moses' perspective next week. But God said, "I will be with you." God said to Moses, "I am who I am." This is what you are to say to the Israelites. When the Israelites say, "Why should we listen to you?" You tell them this: "I am has sent me to you." God said to Moses, "Say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. Assemble the elders of Israel and say to them, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, appeared to me and said, I have watched over you and have seen what has been done to you in Egypt, and I have promised to bring you up out of your misery in Egypt into the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey." God, when Moses said, "Who am I?" God did not say, "Hey, Moses, don't sell yourself short. You're tremendously cool. You've got this great education. You've learned about the royal palace from the inside out. You're a Hebrew. You're one of your people. You don't sell yourself short, Moses." God didn't say any of that. God said, "I will be with you. I'm calling you. I'm sending you. I will be with you." That's the only qualification you need. And that's the only qualification God gave him. It wasn't Moses. God did not scour the earth looking for someone who was up to the job. God went to the least likely person in the world and said, "I'm going to take him and make him the one." Even though nobody respects him, nobody accepts him that I'm sending him to anyway, none of those folks do, I will be with him, and that will be enough. God makes the difference. The hand of God was with him. And that made all of the difference for Moses. And all of the difference for the people to whom Moses was sent. So let's break it down, all of those objections. Moses should have been dead, but God preserved his life. It was not an accident that Moses survived in the Nile River and was found by the daughter of the Pharaoh and was raised in the palace. God did that. God did that. And God, also made it possible for his own mother to nurse him so that he wouldn't grow up completely disconnected. He could hear the stories. He could see the people from his earliest days. He knew he was a Hebrew. But God also made him comfortable among the royalty. I got comfortable in parentheses there because this is speculation, but I think it's reasonable speculation. If going into a palace kind of situation, if you've grown up and lived your entire life as a slave, just going into that environment is going to be daunting and intimidating. But Moses lived there for 35 years or so. He knew what it was like. It was at least familiar, if it wasn't comfortable. But he was rash, he was hot-tempered, and he was violent. And God humbled him in the wilderness. Took 40 years of humbling. 40 years Moses was humbled in the wilderness. He didn't go to be a shepherd to learn the skills of being a great leader. He was a shepherd for 40 years to learn humility. And God humbled him. Sleeping with sheep, I think, will do that to you. God empowered him and guided him. And that's what Moses needed. That was it. The reality is God often picks the unlikeliest people to be his messengers, to be his leaders. And again, we'll talk about what that's like next week for our perspective of if we were the one being called. But let's put ourselves again back in the Pharaoh's shoes, back in the Israelites' shoes. Who is God sending into your life that is an unlikely messenger for you? That is an unlikely prophet, an unlikely spokesperson for God to help you break free from whatever. We saw last week this big long list of all these different kinds of things that we can get enslaved to. Not an exhaustive list. There's a lot more things than I had on the list last week. If you want that list, listen to last week's sermon. It's online. But we get enslaved. We all get enslaved to stuff. Who has God put in your life? Sometime in the past, sometime in the present, or maybe sometime just around the corner. That is an unlikely person to be God's messenger for you. That will speak God's truth to you. And you'll say, really? Why should I listen to this person? They don't know me. They haven't lived my life. They haven't shared my experiences. They don't know what I've been through. Why should I listen to this person? You know, this is someone I gave everything to. I lavished all of this goodness on, and they just spit on it and threw it away and ran away someplace. Threw it in the trash. Now they want to come back and tell me they're God's messenger to me? Who has God put in your life? Who is God putting in your life that you don't really want to listen to? That you really, if you're going to get a message from God, you'd really rather have it from someone else. Send it to me from this person, that person, not them. Not them. Because whoever that is, you have a choice to either do what Pharaoh did and reject and say, I don't care how much power you show. I know who you are. I know what you've done. I will not let go. I will not follow. I will not. That decision cost Pharaoh dearly. Cost him the life of his own son. Cost his people, the lives of millions. Because he rejected the messenger God sent because it wasn't the right person. This ungrateful Hebrew. Why should I listen to him? Or we can be like the Israelites. And we can say, you know what? I never would have guessed Moses. I mean, this is the same guy that murdered and then ran away. This is the same guy. But God's with him. God's with her. What they're saying, I hear the truth of God in it. I hear the power of God in it. I'll listen and respond and step a little more into the freedom that God has for us. God works through unlikely people. God sends unlikely people into our lives, and we can either reject them or we can accept them. We can deny that they're God's messenger, or we can accept that they're God's messenger and receive God's message and God's help and God's deliverance through them. It can be a very humbling thing sometimes, the people that God sends to us, that we have to say, I'm going to be helped by this person, by this person, by this person. Of all the people, It's the last one I would have accepted. Scrooge, that's what Scrooge felt like. Marley, him? Pfft, he's no better than I am. These ghosts, pfft, one's shiny, one's big, and one's scary. What do they have to say? But he accepted. He accepted the messengers. He accepted the message. And he was finally free from those chains that bound him. Let's be like the Israelites. Let's be like Scrooge and listen to the messengers God sends. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen.